Maria Ressa in Manila, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
Let's start with your personal situation. You have, earlier this month, been convicted on this charge of cyber libel, as they're calling it. Has it changed things for you?
Aside from the emotional roller coaster and the fact that we've crossed yet another divide, I think I'm pretty much on the same road I've been on for the last 4 years, which is really standing up for my rights, both as a Filipino and as a journalist.
You're on bail, and I think your legal team have said there will be an appeal. Do you, in any sense, feel frightened right now?
Stephen, I've gone through this. When you've been under attack for 4 years, as we've been, there have been all these stages. It's like the stages of grief, right? In 2016, we were pummeled on social media, exponential attacks that are extremely visceral and, takes you by surprise, the viciousness of it. And those same narratives in 2017 come out of governments' mouths. President Duterte himself then began to equate journalist with criminal. And then in 2018, 11 cases and investigations. I was in and out talking to officials. And 2019, the filing of these cases. I have 8 arrest warrants against me that were filed that year. That was only last year. And I was arrested twice, detained once. I feel like Alice in Wonderland, and I'm down in a rabbit hole. I'm going out, and I'm going to walk out. This verdict that happened on cyber libel, a story we published before the law we allegedly violated, was even in effect. Cements it now, right? That 2016, their journalists are criminals. In 2020, after the weaponization of social media, the weaponization of the law, now I'm convicted. That's the death of 1,000 cuts of our democracy.
There is no doubt that it is not just you that has suffered from repressive tactics coming from government agencies. We can all see that. But nonetheless, the notion that all sorts of freedom of expression are now curtailed and eliminated in the Philippines surely isn't right. If one looks at your country today, there is still a multitude of diverse opinion across the spectrum of politics in different platforms on the media, not least Rappler itself. After all, your website hasn't been shut down. It continues to this day. It has millions of eyeballs on it every single month. The Philippines is not North Korea, nothing like.
Well, who would want to be North Korea, right? In the end, the Philippines is also living under a climate of fear and violence. In fact, when I last interviewed President Duterte, when he was already president, I was one of 4 journalists he gave an interview to in December of 2016. I asked him that specifically. I said, Mr. President, now that you're in charge of actually protecting the Constitution, is it necessary to use violence? And he said, yes. He said it's necessary to use violence and fear. So while you see what looks like a multitude of voices, imagine that those voices also have a Damocles sword hanging over their heads. During our pandemic, people were, based on their posts on social media, people were arrested. I think there's a good veneer of legality for all of these, but we've certainly felt the walls closing in. In order to be able to continue publishing as Rappler, look what I've had to go through. I'm not a criminal, I'm just a journalist.
And obviously, my show's called Hard Talk, so I have to take seriously the charges against you, because as you've indicated that the libel is the least of it. You still face allegations of, my goodness, what a list, fraud, tax evasion, receiving money from the CIA. I mean, you could be in court for years and years to come.
The only thing I can say is that these charges, the 8 criminal charges I'm facing, fall into 3 buckets. The first is cyber libel. The second is securities fraud. And in that, we'll throw in foreign ownership or foreign control, something violating something called the anti-dummy law. And then the third is tax evasion. And again, just like the first case, we were charged with tax evasion about 6 months after we received a prize, an award from the government for being a top corporate taxpayer. Then a little more than 6 months later, we're tax evaders pushed on social media. And in addition to that, to make this charge, they actually had to redefine Rappler from news organization to a dealer in securities. So sure, let's do hard talk. I feel like as a reporter, as someone running a news organization, I give the government and the president the respect that the office demands, I think, but the kinds of death by 1,000 cuts that we've had to absorb just to do our jobs, just to continue doing investigative reporting, I've never lived through anything like this. And I covered Southeast Asia's transition from authoritarian one-man rule to democracy, starting here in the Philippines in 1986.
Maria Ressa, do you think the Filipino public care about your fate and indeed the fate of other journalists in your country? Because one looks at Duterte's approval ratings, they are consistently above 80% approval, the kind of figure that other leaders around the world could only dream about. And the Filipino public are well aware of what he's doing to the press.
I think there are two answers to that question. The first one is the kinds of the propaganda machine and how it uses technology to essentially use it as a behavioral modification system. And I can explain that more later. But the propaganda is exponential and it lifts. When you hear President Duterte is the best, the defender of the poor, even though it's the poor who are dying in the drug war, right? So that's the first step. I think, the age of social media, statistical surveys haven't been able to keep up with these shifts. The second one is, do people care? Yes. And I can see that just based on what's happened. And I think this in particular in 2020, three things have happened. We've had a pandemic, the lockdown. We are just in our 14th week of a very security-driven, militaristic lockdown. It's a lockdown when President Duterte has told Filipinos to stay at home. And he told troops that if they come out, if we break quarantine, he told them to, and this is a direct quote, he said, shoot them dead. That did happen. Almost more than 60,000 people have been arrested during this time period. And because we're locked down, I think there's been more introspection. The second is the shutdown.
I'm going to stop you there, if I may,
yeah.
because it's fascinating what you're saying, but I'm just wondering where your evidence is, because I look at the latest polling I can find in the Philippines. There's a company I'm sure you know well, Social Weather Stations, who are widely respected, and their measurements suggest that the Filipino public as a whole approves still of President Duterte's campaign against illegal drugs. They still seem to favor him despite all of the controversy about his latest anti-terror law, which you and others have described as a fundamental threat to freedom of expression.
That's the third one, right? That's the third one I was going to say, this anti-terror bill.
You have to get real in a way. Everything you say about what Duterte is doing is not deterring a really big majority of Filipinos from giving him their backing.
I think you have to look at the surveys and actually talk to the people who do the surveys. And the biggest question you have to ask them is, how do you count for fear? So before we went into lockdown, this was a question I asked all the time because these surveys are done in the homes of people. They have their numbers, they know who they are, they're normally, their names are given by their village chiefs, the barangay captains. How do you account for fear, right? So not saying that President Duterte isn't popular, because I think his homespun, this kind of, the guy you want to have a beer with, the grandfather you want to have a beer with, that's the narrative. I think that's appealing.
Yes,
but having said that, how do you count for fear? Right?
Interesting question. Now, and I tell you what, that plants in my mind a different idea about fear. Maybe for you, and let's be honest, for a relatively elite personality living in a nice part of Manila, with perhaps more security than most Filipinos, it is easy for you to focus on the threats to freedom which you feel and the fear you talk about. But what about the other Filipinos whose fear is much more street level? It's much more about the insecurity. And your Rappler website has made a point of investigating the drugs war that Duterte has initiated for the last 3-4 years. But the drugs war, according to most Filipinos, has made their streets safer. Yes, they look at the fact that hardly any security personnel have been prosecuted for egregious use of violence, but they also look at the fact that thousands of drug dealers have been taken off the streets, and they like that.
I think that's